Hey guys, Shreyaan here, and welcome back to the first camera basics of 2021. So we'll be starting off this year by learning how to shoot properly in low light. So let's get started. So for this camera basics, this is purely based on a video I shot earlier last year, and it's shot entirely on the Canon 700D in low light with some artificial lighting like the one I'm using right now, but the ISO is so much below average that you don't basically make it out. So first watch the video and then I'll teach you how I did it and what are some steps. So here's the video. Alright, so now that you have watched the video, how was it? Do you like it? Well, nonetheless, let's start with the ISO settings. So I shot that basically all on 100 or 200 ISO, which is really less value compared to the base ISO of the Canon 700D, which is 800. I shot on that low of an ISO because one, it introduces less noise. You do not want a high ISO in low light because it will create a lot of noise. In fact, I can show that to you right now. So I'll just set the ISO really high. Okay, this is the max it will go in video mode, and then I'll decrease the shutter speed. So you'll get this banding effect, and to reduce that I can just close down the aperture. So this looks about correctly exposed. There's a bit of tweaking that you could do, but you can see there's a lot of noise and there's a bit of jitter when I'm moving around. So you see a lot of noise here, and you see a lot of noise in my shadow behind me. So let me change back the settings to what they were. So again, it's 1/30th of a shutter, and the f-stop is fully open, so 3.5, and then the ISO either set to auto, which I recommend in most use cases, but if you're towards a creative workspace and you want to create something that's unique, then you can of course go for a custom ISO. So for example, for this shot I can go with an ISO of 800, but it's a little bit too bright, and if I reduce it down to 400, it's a little bit too dark. So the auto setting basically find the spot in between those two and creates a nice sweet spot in the middle. So now let's talk about the aperture value as shot it in. So again, shoot as widely open as you can. So f3.5 is the aperture value that the EFS 18 to 135 lets me shoot at when I'm fully zoomed out. So if I zoom in, for example, right now the value is 3.5. As I keep zooming in, the value is 5.6 now. So as you zoom in, this lens also crops into your frame, and also it increases your f-stop value. So that's something to keep in mind. It's from 3.6 to 5.6, which is not that much, but again, to get that nice bokeh in the background, you might want to try out a different lens. For example, the 16mm f1.8, which is a very good lens, and it's a bit expensive, but of course it creates a nice shallow depth of field. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, of course, the shutter speed. So this is a very important thing that you have to keep in mind when you're shooting, especially in low light and if you have an artificial light. So right now you can see around me there's no flickering, because I have set the camera to 60 Hertz refresh rate. That means every 60 seconds is taking a shot, and what this basically means is there's no flicker. If you're in the UK, then you want to set it to 50, or in some cameras it's auto, which it will automatically detect the light around you and change it depending on that. So for example, if I just tinker around with the settings and let's say I decrease it, so now I have less light, but you can see that the banding of the light and the flickering, and maybe to make that a bit more visible to you guys, you can see that. So again, remember, the best shutter speed is twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 60 fps, then 120 of a shutter is perfect, and if you're shooting at 60 fps, it's 30 fps, and 1/60th of a shutter. So I'm on 1/60th right now. Again, I can go down to 1/30th if I want, which will make it a bit brighter, but 1/60th gives me the most amount of motion blur that's natural to the eye. So next we're going to talk about motion blur. So of course, motion blur is a key thing in low light because it's the thing that introduces a lot of noise, because the camera has no detail whatsoever in the low light itself, and motion blur is just making it harder for the camera to see. So typically, I told you before in camera basics that you need to have a shutter speed of double your frame rate if you want the most natural. Sometimes you just want a perfect shutter speed where there's no moving motion, it's perfect, and the frame is perfectly captured, so there's no motion blur. But that of course depends on you. I would go with double the frame rate because it creates some natural amount, and it also helps in low light. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, of course, the frame rate you're shooting in. So I shot this in 30 fps on 1080p, and this camera can actually do 720p 60 fps, but it was 720p and I didn't want it to go too low on the quality. So I could have used my phone, which can shoot at 1080p 240 fps, but again the quality won't be as good as the camera that I'm using right now because of the sensor itself. So you can see the sensor size. This is the main sensor, the main camera, and this is only like 1 to 2 millimeters in depth and about 1 centimeter in both height and length. So it's a small sensor, but each pixel is about 1 micron, which is really small. And this is a rule that applies to all sensors. The bigger the pixel, the more light is going to have coming in, the better the low light performance will be. So you might have heard about the 108 megapixel camera in the new Xiaomi Mi 11 Ultra and the Samsung S21 Ultra, but those are 108 megapixel sensors because the pixels are so densely packed together that they're really small, which means you get a finer detail and finer image, but that means that in low light each individual pixel is getting less light. That means more noise, and when there's more noise the photo won't be as clear. So always remember, that's why bigger DSLRs like the one I'm using right now don't count megapixels that heavily. So this is, I think, a 20 point something megapixel camera. Of course my phone has a 48 megapixel camera, and of course this still takes better photos than it. And you might have also heard about Olympus. It's a camera manufacturer that also introduced 100 and something megapixel camera. So Olympus has been specialized in camera technology for many years, many decades actually, and of course you might say that they might have found a perfect balance between the low light performance of a full-fledged DSLR and the quality of a 108 megapixel camera. Again, there are size standards of sensors which you can see right here: APS-C, micro four thirds and full frame. So those are sizes of the sensor itself. You can see the dimensions right here, and these dimensions depend on the crop factor, which I'm going to discuss in a later episode of Camera Basics. So definitely stay tuned for that, and subscribe if you're enjoying this video so I can keep making videos like this. So that depends on the sensor size. So each pixel, the smaller the pixel, like I told you before, the worse low light performance it will have. So again, more megapixels don't always mean better shots, but the bigger the pixel and the less megapixel it has don't also mean always the best shot. So for example, if I take a 2 megapixel photo, which some phones do include in their macro camera, the photo will be acceptable, but in low light, if it doesn't have big pixels, it's going to be not as good, because now you are even losing the detail even of the noise, and it's a 2 megapixel camera, so what can you expect from it? So if you haven't seen my other episodes of Camera Basics, they're linked up here. You can check them out here, or you can click the link in the description to view the full playlist, or you can click on the individual videos where I go through a lot of Camera Basics with you guys. So what did we learn in this episode? We learned how to shoot effectively in low light. We learned that more megapixels don't always mean better quality photos, and we learned what ISO and shutter speed and aperture values are best for low light. So that's what we need for this Camera Basics. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you aren't already. That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one.